The morning fog hung thick over Wellington Barracks in London as 300 young men stood in perfect rows, their breath visible in the cold air. Among them was a 22-year-old recruit who had dreamed of this moment since he was a child, watching the changing of the guard ceremony with his father. He looked around at the sea of nervous faces, each one representing someone who thought they had what it took to become one of the most elite guards in the world. The heavy doors of the barracks swung open, and out walked a commanding officer whose chest was covered in medals and ribbons that spoke of decades of service. His footsteps echoed across the parade ground as he walked slowly in front of the recruits, his eyes scanning each face with the intensity of someone who could see straight through to a person's soul. The young recruit felt his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "Gentlemen," the officer's voice boomed across the silent courtyard. "Most of you will not be here in 7 days. This is not a statement meant to discourage you. It is simply a fact." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You may think you are here because you are physically fit. You may think you passed the initial test because you can run fast or do more push-ups than your mates. Let me be very clear about something. Physical fitness is merely your entry ticket to this selection. What we are looking for cannot be measured by how much weight you can lift or how fast you can complete an obstacle course." The officer stopped in front of a recruit who was slightly shorter than the others. "The Queen's Guard stands at the gates of history itself. You will be stationed at places where kings and queens have walked for centuries. Tourists from every corner of the world will visit these palaces, and many of them will see you as nothing more than a living statue, a photo opportunity, entertainment for their holiday." His voice grew harder. "Some will try to make you laugh. Others will try to make you angry. Some will insult you, mock you, and test your patience in ways you cannot yet imagine. And through it all, you must remain absolutely unflappable." The young recruit felt a cold realization wash over him. He had trained for months to get physically ready for this. He had run until his lungs burned and done exercises until his muscles screamed for mercy. But standing perfectly still while people mocked him? That was something he had never truly prepared for. He glanced at the recruit standing next to him, a tall guy who looked like he could break bricks with his bare hands. Even he looked uncertain now. The first week was designed to filter out those who lacked mental fortitude. Every morning began at 4:30, not with physical training but with standing practice. The recruits were ordered to stand at attention in the parade ground for 2 hours before breakfast. No moving, no scratching, no adjusting their position, just standing. It sounds simple enough. But by the second day, the young recruit understood why this was so difficult. His back began to ache. His feet felt like they were on fire. A fly landed on his nose and he wanted desperately to swat it away, but he kept his hands firmly at his sides. Around him he could hear the quiet sounds of struggle. Someone's stomach growled loudly. Another recruit's breathing became heavy and labored. A few men started shifting their weight from foot to foot, unable to maintain the rigid posture required. The drill sergeants prowled among them like wolves, watching for any sign of weakness, any hint that someone was about to break. By the third day, 50 recruits had quit. They simply walked off the parade ground during the standing exercises, their faces showing a mixture of shame and relief. The young recruit watched them go, understanding completely why they made that choice. Every muscle in his body hurt. His mind kept wandering to thoughts of his warm bed, of breakfast, of anything other than standing still in the cold morning air. But something inside him refused to quit. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was the memory of his father's face when he told him he had been accepted for selection. The commanding officer appeared again on the 5th day. The 300 recruits had been reduced to 180. He walked among them slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Some of you are wondering why we make you stand for hours without purpose. You think perhaps we are being cruel, or that this is some sort of hazing ritual." He stopped and turned to face them all. "Let me tell you something about the reality of being a Queen's Guard. You will stand at your post for 4-hour shifts. During those 4 hours, you cannot check your phone, you cannot chat with tourists, you cannot take a break because you are tired or bored or uncomfortable. You are a symbol of something greater than yourself. You represent centuries of tradition, discipline, and unwavering duty." He pointed toward the palace gates in the distance. "Out there in the real world, people will test you in ways you cannot imagine. They will try to break your concentration. They will do foolish things to get a reaction from you. And if you fail, if you laugh or speak or lose your composure, you do not just embarrass yourself. You embarrass the entire regiment, the crown, and every guard who has stood at that post before you. This is why we break you down now. This is why we test your mental strength before we ever put you in that uniform." The recruit felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. This was not just about standing still. This was about becoming something more than human, something unshakable. He looked around at the other recruits who remained. Their faces showed the same determination he felt. They were the ones who refused to give up, who pushed through the pain and boredom and doubt. By the end of the first week, only 120 recruits remained. The young recruit was among them, exhausted but still standing. He had learned his first crucial lesson. The battle was not against the drill sergeants or the physical challenges. The battle was against his own mind, his own doubts, his own desire for comfort. And if he was going to make it through this training, he would need to learn how to win that battle every single day. As he lay in his bunk that night, every part of his body aching, he realized something important. The easy part was over. The real training was about to begin. And according to the older soldiers, what came next would make this first week feel like a holiday. He closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself mentally for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that only 30 of them would ultimately earn the right to wear the bearskin hat and red tunic of the Queen's Guard. The second phase of training began on a Monday morning that felt colder than any day before it. The remaining recruits were told to report to the drill square in full ceremonial dress for the first time. The young recruit struggled to fasten all the buttons on the thick red wool tunic. The bearskin hat, made from real Canadian black bear fur, weighed nearly 2 pounds and sat uncomfortably on his head. The entire uniform weighed over 30 pounds, and that was before adding the rifle. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. "You think you look impressive, do you?" A drill sergeant barked as the recruits assembled in formation. "You think that uniform makes you special?" His voice dripped with contempt. "That uniform means nothing without the discipline to wear it properly. And today we begin teaching you what that discipline truly means." They called it the Stonewall phase, and the young recruit quickly understood why. For the next 6 hours they were ordered to stand completely motionless in the parade ground. No breaks, no water, no movement whatsoever. The drill sergeants walked among them constantly, circling like sharks who had caught the scent of blood. Their job was simple: break the recruit's concentration by any means necessary. The first hour was manageable. The recruit focused on keeping his breathing steady and his posture perfect. His rifle was held at exactly the right angle. His chin was up, his shoulders were back. He stared straight ahead at a point on the wall across from him, trying to empty his mind of all distractions. Then the real torture began. A sergeant stopped directly in front of him, so close that the recruit could smell coffee on his breath. "You think you are strong?" The sergeant whispered, his voice barely audible. "You think you have what it takes?" Then he screamed at full volume, inches from the recruit's face. "You are pathetic." The sudden explosion of sound made the recruit's heart jump, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. Another sergeant came from behind and began describing in great detail how the recruit's boots were scuffed, how his uniform was slightly wrinkled, how he was a disgrace to everyone who had worn that uniform before him. The words washed over the recruit like waves crashing against a rock. He wanted desperately to defend himself, to explain that he had polished those boots for an hour, that he had pressed his uniform 3 times. But he remained silent and still. Around him, other recruits were receiving similar treatment. One man, who had been confident and cocky during the first week, was visibly shaking as a sergeant screamed about his deceased grandfather, saying the old man must be rolling in his grave watching his grandson fail so spectacularly. It was brutal and personal, designed to find each recruit's emotional weak points and exploit them ruthlessly. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature inside the heavy wool uniform became unbearable. Sweat poured down the young recruit's face, stinging his eyes. He wanted to blink it away, to wipe his forehead, but his hands remained locked in position. The bearskin hat seemed to trap heat around his head like an oven. He could feel perspiration running down his back, soaking through his shirt. By the 3rd hour, the physical discomfort merged with the mental assault to create something nearly unbearable. A sergeant stood beside the recruit and began blowing a whistle directly into his ear in short, sharp blasts. The piercing sound was agonizing, but the recruit forced himself to focus on that point on the wall, to retreat deeper into his own mind where the noise could not reach him. "Your mother called this morning," another sergeant said conversationally, though the recruit knew it was a lie. "She said she is worried about you. She said, maybe this is not the right path for you. She said, maybe you should come home where it is safe and comfortable. The words were designed to plant seeds of doubt, to make him question why he was putting himself through this torture. 4 recruits broke during the 4th hour. One simply dropped his rifle and walked off the parade ground without a word. Another started crying silently, tears streaming down his face until a sergeant told him to leave if he could not control himself. The young recruit felt a wave of panic watching them go. If they could not handle this, how could he? What made him different from them? The answer came from somewhere deep inside. He was not different. He was not stronger or better. But he was more stubborn. He had promised himself he would see this through and he would rather pass out than quit. That realization gave him strength. The sergeants could scream. They could insult him. They could make him as uncomfortable as possible, but they could not make him quit. Only he could do that. During the 5th hour, a sergeant fabricated an emergency. He ran up to the recruit shouting that there had been an accident, that someone was hurt, that they needed help immediately. Every instinct screamed at the recruit to react, to turn his head, to help. But he remembered the officer's words from the first week. This was a test. Everything was a test. He remained frozen in place, his eyes never leaving that point on the wall. Good, the sergeant said quietly, moving on to the next recruit. Very good. Those 2 words meant more to the young recruit than any praise he had ever received in his life. It meant he was learning. It meant he was succeeding where others had failed. His legs were trembling with exhaustion. His back felt like it might snap, and he was so thirsty his tongue felt thick in his mouth. But he had passed a test he had not even known was coming. The 6th hour was the worst. His body began to play tricks on him. He felt dizzy and disoriented. The wall in front of him seemed to move and shift. He was not sure if seconds or minutes were passing. Time became meaningless. There was only the standing, the heat, the pain, and the constant barrage of noise and insults from the sergeants. Finally, mercifully, a whistle blew 3 times. "Stand down," the head sergeant ordered. The recruits collapsed where they stood, some falling to their knees, others sitting heavily on the ground. The young recruit lowered himself carefully, his legs threatening to give out completely. He pulled off the bearskin hat and felt cool air hit his soaked hair. It felt like heaven. 73 remaining, the head sergeant announced, looking at a clipboard. 27 of you could not handle a simple standing exercise. If you cannot stand still for 6 hours in a controlled environment, you certainly cannot do it while tourists harass you, and the summer sun beats down on you outside Buckingham Palace. He looked at the exhausted recruits, sprawled on the parade ground. Tomorrow we do it again. And the day after that. And the day after that. Until standing like a stone wall becomes as natural to you as breathing. That night, the young recruit could barely climb into his bunk. His entire body was one massive cramp. But as he lay there in the darkness, listening to the quiet groans and whispers of the other recruits, he felt something he had not expected. Pride. He had survived something that had broken nearly 30 men. He had discovered reserves of mental strength he did not know he possessed. Whatever came next, he now knew with certainty that he could endure it. His ego had been broken down, yes, but in its place something harder and more resilient was being built. 3 weeks into training, the recruits gathered in a classroom for the first time. The young recruit was grateful to be sitting down, even if it was just for a lecture. His body had adapted somewhat to the long hours of standing, but every day still brought new levels of discomfort. He settled into his chair and waited to see what this session would cover. A medical officer entered the room, carrying a laptop and a stack of folders. Behind her, a screen showed a video frozen on its first frame. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "Today we are going to discuss something that the public finds endlessly fascinating, but that you need to understand as a matter of safety. We are going to talk about fainting on duty." She clicked a button and the video began to play. It showed a guard standing at attention outside a palace. Tourists walked by taking photos. Everything seemed normal. Then, without warning, the guard's knees buckled and he fell forward, hitting the ground face first with a sickening thud. Several gasps came from the recruits watching. "This happens," the medical officer said calmly, pausing the video, "and it will likely happen to some of you at some point in your career. The question is not whether you might faint. The question is whether you know how to faint safely." The young recruit leaned forward, suddenly very interested. He had seen viral videos of guards collapsing during ceremonies, but he had always assumed those men had simply failed somehow. Now he was learning there was much more to it. "Let me explain the physiology," the officer continued, bringing up a diagram of the human body. "When you stand perfectly still for long periods, especially in hot weather and heavy uniform, several things happen. Blood pools in your legs instead of circulating properly. Your body temperature rises. You may become dehydrated. Your brain receives less oxygen. Eventually, your body makes a decision to protect itself by shutting down temporarily. That is a faint." She clicked to another slide showing warning signs. "You need to learn to recognize when you are about to lose consciousness. The signs include tunnel vision, where your peripheral vision starts to disappear. You may feel dizzy or nauseous. You might hear a ringing in your ears. Some people describe feeling like they are very far away from their own body. These are your warning signals, and you have perhaps 30 seconds to 1 minute once they start." A recruit raised his hand. "Ma'am, if we feel these signs, should we call for help or step back from our post?" The medical officer's expression was understanding but firm. "In an ideal world, yes. But you need to understand something about the reality of royal duty. There are times when leaving your post is simply not an option. During major ceremonies, during important state visits, during moments when the eyes of the world are watching, in those situations you stand until you physically cannot stand anymore, and that is why we teach you how to fall safely." She played several more videos, each showing a guard fainting. The recruits watched in fascination and growing concern. Some guards fell straight backward, others crumpled where they stood, and a few fell forward onto their faces. "Notice the difference," she said. "The guards who fall backward often sustain head injuries. Those who crumple sideways may injure their arms or ribs as they try to catch themselves. But those who fall forward, while it looks dramatic, usually protect both themselves and their weapons." The next hour was spent learning the technique of controlled fainting. They practiced in the classroom first, learning to recognize the split second when consciousness was slipping away. "The moment you feel that point of no return," the medical officer instructed, "you tuck your chin to your chest, you keep your arms at your sides, and you let yourself fall forward. Your body's natural instinct will be to try to catch yourself, but that is when you get injured. If you fall forward with your arms controlled, you will hit the ground on your chest and stomach, not your face." Then came the practical application. In the parade ground, wearing full uniform, the recruits practiced standing in the summer heat with their knees locked in a specific way. "This is dangerous," the medical officer warned, "which is why we do it in a controlled setting with medical staff present. But you need to experience what fainting feels like so you recognize it in the real situation." The young recruit stood at attention, his knees locked slightly more than usual. The sun beat down on his bearskin hat. 15 minutes passed, then 20. He began to feel strange, like he was floating slightly above the ground. The sounds around him became muffled and distant. The edges of his vision started to darken, as if someone was slowly closing curtains around his field of view. "Remember your training?" a voice called out, though it sounded like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. "If you are going to faint, do it properly." The world tilted. The young recruit felt his consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers. In that last moment of awareness, he tucked his chin and kept his arms rigid at his sides. Then everything went black. He came to seconds later, lying on his stomach on the parade ground, medical staff already at his side. His face had not hit the ground. His rifle was still properly positioned beside him. He had done it correctly. "Well done," the medical officer said, helping him sit up slowly. "You will feel disoriented for a few minutes, but you are fine. You just experienced and survived your first tactical feint." Over the next week, all the recruits went through similar experiences. Some fainted naturally during the heat exposure exercises. Others had to be pushed further, standing for longer periods until their bodies shut down. 3 recruits injured themselves by trying to fight the feint, instinctively reaching out to catch themselves and breaking fingers or wrists in the process. They were removed from training to heal, and everyone else learned from their mistakes. The young recruit learned something important during this phase. Fainting was not a failure. Fighting your body's protective mechanisms was the real failure. The truly professional guard knew his limits, recognized the warning signs, and when collapse was inevitable, he did it in a way that protected himself, his weapon, and the dignity of his position. He learned that there was skill even in losing consciousness, but more importantly, he learned techniques to prevent fainting in the first place. They were taught to wiggle their toes inside their boots, creating tiny muscle movements that helped blood circulation without being visible to observers. They learned breathing techniques that increased oxygen flow to the brain. They practiced subtle weight shifts, moving from one leg to the other so smoothly that no one watching would notice. During a particularly brutal afternoon training session, the recruit felt the warning signs beginning. The tunnel vision started creeping in, but this time, instead of letting himself fall, he began wiggling his toes vigorously inside his boots. He took slow, deep breaths through his nose. He shifted his weight slightly. The symptoms receded. He had beaten it. That evening, the medical officer gathered the remaining recruits for a final talk. You have learned something that seems strange to civilians. You have learned how to safely lose consciousness while standing at attention, but more importantly, you have learned to recognize your body's limits and to work within them. A guard who faints on duty is not a failure. A guard who faints and injures himself or drops his weapon is a failure. A guard who recognizes the signs and prevents the faint through proper technique is a professional. You are becoming professionals. As the young recruit lay in his bunk that night, he thought about how strange his training had become. He was learning to stand so still that his body forgot how to function. He was learning to let himself fall unconscious in a controlled manner. He was learning to push his physical limits in ways he never imagined possible. And somehow all of this was making him into something greater than he had been before, something unflappable. The morning briefing was different from usual. Instead of the parade ground, the recruits were taken to a large warehouse building they had never entered before. Inside, it had been set up to look like a section of palace grounds, complete with gates, barriers, and even fake tourist crowds in the background. The young recruit felt his stomach tighten with nervous anticipation. "Welcome to Hell Week," the head sergeant announced with something that might have been a smile. "For the next 7 days, you will experience everything tourists might do to break your concentration. And I mean everything. We have hired professional actors whose only job is to make you react, to make you laugh, to make you angry, to make you embarrassed, to make you lose control. If you react inappropriately even once during these 7 days, you are finished. This is not an exaggeration. One mistake and you go home." The young recruit took his position at a mock palace gate. He had become reasonably good at standing still during the physical training, but this felt different. More unpredictable, more personal. He could handle drill sergeants screaming at him because that was obviously training. But actors pretending to be tourists? That felt like something else entirely. The first tourist approached after just 5 minutes. A middle-aged man with a camera. He seemed harmless enough, taking photos from a respectful distance. Then he stepped closer, and closer, until he was standing directly beside the recruit, his face inches away. "Oi, mate," the man said loudly. "I bet you cannot keep a straight face. I bet I can make you smile. Watch this." The man began making ridiculous faces, crossing his eyes, sticking out his tongue, pulling his ears. The recruit stared straight ahead, his expression carved from stone. The man tried different approaches, making kissing noises, doing a silly dance, telling jokes. Nothing worked. After 10 minutes, the man shrugged and walked away. The recruit felt a small surge of victory, but that was just the beginning. The actors became progressively more aggressive and creative. A woman approached dressed in barely any clothing, dancing provocatively and making inappropriate suggestions. The young recruit felt his face growing hot, but he kept his eyes fixed forward. A group of teenagers surrounded him, shouting insults about his appearance, his manhood, his intelligence. He remained motionless. Then came the actor who found his weakness. A young woman approached, pushing a baby stroller. She stopped in front of him and began talking to the baby in a sweet voice. "Look at the silly guard," she cooed. "Does he think he is a robot? Is he even a real person?" Something about the innocence of the scenario caught the recruit off guard. He felt the corner of his mouth twitch, the beginning of a smile. A whistle blew immediately. "Freeze!" a sergeant shouted. The recruit's heart sank. The sergeant walked over slowly, his face showing disappointment. "You almost smiled. A civilian watching might not have seen it, but I saw it. That twitch of your mouth, that is unacceptable." The sergeant leaned in close. "If you cannot control your face when a woman talks to a baby, how will you control it when drunk football fans sing crude songs at you? When someone tells you your uniform looks stupid? When a child tugs on your coat?" The recruit was given a yellow warning card. 3 yellow cards meant dismissal from the program. He had just used 1/3 of his margin for error on day 1 of 7. That night he barely slept, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. Day 2 introduced physical provocations. Actors would accidentally bump into the guards, step on their feet, or lean against them. The young recruit learned quickly to brace himself when someone approached too closely. When an actor pushed against his shoulder, he remained solid as a brick wall, not yielding an inch. When someone stepped on his boot, he did not flinch or look down. But the real test came when an actor reached out and touched his rifle. This crossed a line from annoyance into potential threat. The recruit had been taught a specific response for this exact situation. In one swift motion, he took a thunderous step forward, bringing his rifle with the bayonet attached down to a defensive position. "Step back from the Queen's Guard!" His voice boomed with an authority that surprised even him. The actor jumped backward, hands raised, looking genuinely startled. The sergeants watching made notes on their clipboards. The recruit had executed the maneuver perfectly. He was authorized to use that verbal warning when someone touched his weapon or attempted to breach his post. After the warning, if the person persisted, he was legally permitted to use necessary force to protect himself and his position. Day 3 brought psychological warfare. The actors began saying things designed to burrow into the recruits' minds. They mentioned family members by name, having obviously been briefed on each recruit's background. They brought up insecurities, fears, and doubts. One actor approached the young recruit and said in a conversational tone, "Your father would not be proud of you standing here like a toy soldier. He would want you to do something meaningful with your life." The words hit like physical blows, but the recruit had learned something during the previous weeks. Words only had the power he gave them. He had created what the training psychologist called a mental fortress, a place inside his mind where external provocations could not reach. He imagined those words bouncing off invisible walls, never touching his true self. The actor eventually gave up and moved on to easier targets. By day 4, 6 more recruits had been dismissed. 2 had laughed at jokes. 1 had cursed at an actor who insulted his mother. 3 had physically flinched or moved when startled by loud noises. The remaining recruits were exhausted, their nerves frayed from constant harassment, but they were adapting. They were learning to see the actors not as real people but as obstacles to be endured. Day 5 introduced group provocations. Crowds of actors would surround a guard, all talking at once, creating chaos and confusion. The young recruit found himself in the center of 20 people, all shouting different things, waving their arms, taking flash photos directly in his face. The noise was overwhelming, the lights disorienting. He felt panic rising in his chest, but he remembered his breathing techniques, focused on a point beyond the crowd, and let their chaos wash over him like water over a rock. Day 6 was perhaps the strangest. The actors were instructed to be kind and genuine. They approached with sincere compliments, heartfelt stories about why they respected the guards, even offers of water or snacks. This was somehow harder to resist than the provocations. When someone is cruel, you can harden yourself against them. When someone is kind, your natural human instinct is to respond, to smile, to say thank you. 3 recruits failed on day 6, unable to maintain their composure in the face of genuine human warmth. The final day combined everything. Physical provocations, verbal abuse, psychological warfare, kindness, crowds, individuals, noise, and silence. The young recruit stood at his post for 8 continuous hours while actors threw everything at him. Someone spilled a drink on his boots. Another person sang an embarrassing song about him. A child asked him repeatedly if he was a real person or a statue. Through it all, he remained absolutely motionless and silent. When the final whistle blew, signaling the end of Hell Week, the recruit felt like he had aged 10 years. Of the 73 recruits who had started this phase, only 41 remained. The head sergeant addressed them in the warehouse. "You have experienced in 7 days what you might experience in 7 months of actual duty. The tourists you will face will be less trained than our actors, less creative in their provocations. But they will be unpredictable, and there will be moments when something catches you off guard." He looked at each of them in turn. "But now you know something important. You know that you can withstand almost anything. You know that your mind is stronger than any external provocation. You know the difference between genuine threats that require action and mere annoyances that require only patience. You are becoming what we need you to be. You are becoming unflappable." That night, as the young recruit finally relaxed in his bunk, he realized something profound. He was not the same person who had arrived at these barracks months ago. That person would have laughed at the jokes, gotten angry at the insults, been flattered by the compliments. But through weeks of brutal training, a new version of himself had emerged. Someone who could stand like stone while chaos swirled around him. Someone who could distinguish between his true self and the external world trying to shake it. Someone who was finally becoming a real Queen's Guard. The recruits filed into a room they had never seen before. Unlike the harsh military spaces they had grown accustomed to, this room was surprisingly calm. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, and at the front stood a woman in civilian clothes with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She introduced herself as Dr. Patterson, a military psychologist who had worked with special forces units around the world. "Sit down, please," she said, gesturing to the chairs. "And I mean actually sit, relax. You have been standing for weeks now. Today, we work on your minds, not your bodies." The young recruit sank gratefully into a chair, his muscles practically sighing with relief. He had expected more punishment, more tests, more screaming sergeants. This felt almost too good to be true. "I want you to understand something," Dr. Patterson began, walking slowly around the circle. "Physical training can take you very far. You have learned to stand for hours, to withstand heat and cold, to ignore physical pain. But there is a limit to what the body can endure. The mind, however, is different. The mind can go places the body cannot. The mind can create realities that do not exist in the physical world. And that is what we are going to learn to use." She explained that the human brain was incredibly powerful, but also easily distracted. When you stand at your post for 4 hours, what is the greatest challenge? Is it the aching feet? The tired muscles? For most of you, the answer is no. The greatest challenge is boredom, the wandering mind, the thoughts that creep in telling you this is pointless, that you want to quit, that you cannot endure another minute. The young recruit nodded along with the others. This was exactly his experience. The physical pain was manageable, but the mental battle, the constant fight against his own thoughts, that was exhausting. "I am going to teach you something that ancient monks discovered thousands of years ago, that modern athletes use, that special operations soldiers rely on. I am going to teach you how to build a mental fortress." Dr. Patterson dimmed the light slightly. "Close your eyes, everyone, no peeking. This only works if you actually do it." The recruits closed their eyes. The room fell silent except for the sound of breathing. "Imagine a room." Dr. Patterson's voice was calm and steady. "A room that exists only in your mind. It can look like anything you want. Maybe it is a library with endless books. Maybe it is a beach with waves crashing. Maybe it is your childhood bedroom. The details do not matter. What matters is that this room is yours and only yours." The young recruit imagined a small room with stone walls like a castle chamber. There was a single window showing a view of mountains. A comfortable chair sat in the center. It felt safe, solid, permanent. "This room is your fortress," Dr. Patterson continued. "When you are standing at your post and the world becomes too much, when tourists are screaming and your body is aching and your mind is telling you to quit, you can retreat to this room. Your body stays at the post, performing its duty mechanically, but your consciousness, your true self, goes to this fortress where nothing can touch you." Over the next few hours, they practiced entering and exiting this mental state. At first, the young recruit found it difficult. His mind kept wandering, or he would fall asleep, or he would lose the image of his fortress room. But gradually, with practice, he learned to slip into that space while keeping his physical body alert and aware of his surroundings. "This is called dissociation," Dr. Patterson explained during a break. "But not in the harmful sense. This is controlled dissociation. You are learning to separate your consciousness from your immediate physical experience. Fighter pilots do this during long missions. Surgeons do this during complicated operations. You will do this while standing guard." The next phase of training tested this new skill. The recruit stood in formation while wearing headphones that played disturbing sounds at random intervals. Babies crying, glass breaking, alarms blaring, people screaming, jackhammers pounding, dogs barking. The sounds were designed to trigger emotional responses, to break concentration, to force a reaction. The young recruit stood with the chaos blasting into his ears, but he was not really there. He was in his fortress room, watching the mountains through his window, sitting in his comfortable chair. The sounds became distant, like they were happening to someone else in another world. His body remained at attention, His eyes focused straight ahead, but his mind was elsewhere, untouchable. After 2 hours, the headphones were removed. "Excellent," Dr. Patterson said, walking among them. "Only 2 of you flinched when the alarm sounds played. The rest of you successfully maintained your composure while experiencing significant auditory stress. This is real progress." But then she dropped a bombshell. "However, I need to warn you about something. This technique is powerful, but it has a weakness. And that weakness is personal memories, especially emotional ones. Your fortress can protect you from external chaos, but it cannot protect you from internal triggers. Things that remind you of people you love, places you miss, moments that meant something to you. Those can crack your fortress walls like nothing else." She was right. During the next training session, they played recordings of everyday sounds. A mother calling her child, children laughing on a playground, a dog barking happily, birthday party celebrations. For the young recruit, it was the sound of children laughing that did it. It reminded him instantly of his younger sister, of summer days playing in their garden, of a simpler time before all this intensity. He felt his eyes begin to water, his throat tighten. His fortress walls trembled. "Stop," Dr. Patterson said, noticing his distress. She walked over and spoke quietly so only he could hear. "You have found your trigger." The sound of children laughing. "This is valuable information. Now you know what can break you, which means you can prepare defenses against it." She taught him a technique called emotional compartmentalization. When you hear that trigger sound, you acknowledge it. You do not fight it or pretend it is not affecting you. You say to yourself, "Yes, that reminds me of my sister. Yes, I miss her. Yes, I will see her again after this duty is done." You acknowledge the emotion, you give it space, but then you put it in a box in your fortress room. You tell yourself, "This feeling is valid, but I will experience it fully later when I am off duty. Right now I have a job to do." The young recruit practiced this over and over. They played the children's laughter. He felt the emotion rise. He acknowledged it, placed it mentally in a box in the corner of his fortress room, and returned to his calm center. After a dozen repetitions, the sound lost some of its power over him. He could hear it without being completely overwhelmed. Dr. Patterson gathered all the recruits for a final session. "I want to talk about the difference between suppression and compartmentalization. Suppression is trying to push down emotions, pretending they do not exist. This does not work long term. The emotions build up like pressure in a container until they explode. Compartmentalization is different. You acknowledge the emotions exist, but you choose when and where to process them fully. You are not robots. You are humans learning to control when you respond to your humanity." She had them practice various mental exercises, counting games to keep their minds engaged during long-standing periods, visualization techniques to make time pass more quickly, memory palace methods to mentally walk through familiar places, examining every detail to occupy their thoughts, mathematical problems to solve in their heads, poems to recite mentally, stories to tell themselves. "Your mind needs occupation," she explained. "An idle mind during a 4-hour shift is a mind that will betray you. It will focus on discomfort, boredom, doubt, but a mind actively engaged in solving problems, or exploring memories, or creating stories, that is a mind that can endure almost anything." The young recruit developed his own mental routine. During his practice standing sessions, he would spend the first hour mentally walking through his childhood home, remembering every detail of every room. The second hour, he would do complex multiplication in his head, seeing how high he could count by 17s or 23s. The third hour, he would compose letters in his mind to family members, choosing each word carefully. The fourth hour, if needed, he would retreat fully to his fortress and simply exist in that peaceful space. By the end of this training phase, something remarkable had happened. The recruits discovered they could stand for extended periods without it feeling like torture. Not because it became physically easier, but because they were no longer prisoners of the experience. They had learned to separate their consciousness from their circumstances. They had built fortresses that no external chaos could breach. They had mastered their own minds. Dr. Patterson's final words stayed with the young recruit. "What you have learned here goes far beyond military service. You have learned that you are not your thoughts, you are not your emotions, and you are not your physical discomfort. You are something deeper, something that can observe all those things without being controlled by them. You have learned perhaps the most important lesson of all, that true strength comes not from controlling the world around you, but from mastering the world within you. That is what makes you unflappable. The bus arrived at the palace gates at 11 in the evening. The young recruit stepped off with 5 other trainees, their breath visible in the cold night air. This was their first overnight training session at an actual royal residence, not a training facility. The weight of that fact settled heavily on his shoulders. This was real. These were the grounds he might actually guard once training was complete. A veteran guard met them at the gate. His name was Thompson, and he had served for 12 years. His face showed the weathered look of someone who had stood through countless nights like this one. "Welcome to Night Watch," he said, his voice quiet and serious. "This is different from everything you have trained for so far. Day shifts have crowds, noise, activity, things to focus on. Night shifts have silence, darkness, and your own thoughts. Many guards find night duty harder than anything else." They were escorted to their positions. The young recruit was assigned to a side entrance of the palace, a spot that saw minimal traffic even during the day. At night it was completely deserted. Thompson stayed with him as he took his position. The other trainees were scattered to different posts around the grounds. "The first hour is usually manageable," Thompson said, standing beside him. "You are fresh, alert, curious about your surroundings. The second hour is when drowsiness begins. The third hour is when your mind starts playing tricks on you. The fourth hour is when you discover what you are really made of." He paused, looking at the darkness beyond the palace lights. "I will be nearby checking on you periodically, but for most of the night you will be alone with only your discipline to keep you standing." Thompson left, and the young recruit was truly alone for the first time in months. During training there were always other recruits nearby, always sergeants watching, always some sense of shared experience. But here in the darkness there was only him, the ancient stone walls of the palace behind him and the empty courtyard ahead. The first hour passed easily enough. He used the techniques Dr. Patterson had taught him, mentally cataloging everything he could see. The ornate ironwork of the gate, the precise pattern of stones in the courtyard, the way shadows fell across the building. He counted windows, noted architectural details, kept his mind busy and engaged. The second hour brought tiredness. His body, which had been tense with nervous energy, began to relax too much. His eyelids felt heavy. The cold helped keep him alert, but he could feel sleep trying to claim him. He shifted his mental exercises to more active ones, doing multiplication tables in his head, trying to calculate complex math problems. Anything to keep his brain working. Then around 1 in the morning, something strange began to happen. In the darkness beyond the palace lights, he started seeing movement. Shapes that might have been people or might have been shadows. His heart rate increased. Was someone out there? Should he raise an alarm? He stared into the darkness, trying to determine if the movement was real or imagined. Thompson appeared beside him so quietly the recruit nearly jumped. "You are seeing things," Thompson said matter-of-factly. "Shadows that seem to move. Sounds that might be footsteps. Your mind is trying to find patterns and threats where none exist. This happens to everyone during Night Watch. The question is whether you can recognize it as your mind playing tricks rather than actual threats." "How do I tell the difference?" the recruit whispered, his eyes still scanning the darkness. "Experience, mostly," Thompson replied. "But a good rule is this. If you think you see something, watch it carefully. If it keeps moving in the same way without ever coming closer or changing pattern, it is probably shadows and wind. Real threats move with purpose. They hesitate, they hide, they advance. Your mind creating phantom threats will show you movement that never actually goes anywhere." The recruit watched the shadows with this new understanding. Thompson was right. The movements he was seeing were repetitive, always in the same spots where trees swayed or lights flickered. Nothing was actually approaching. His tired brain was simply trying to find threats to stay alert. It was unsettling how convincing these illusions were. Thompson checked his watch. "I am going to leave you alone now for the next 2 hours. This is when it gets hard. You have been standing for over 2 hours already. You are tired. You are cold. And there is nothing happening to hold your attention. This is the real test of Night Watch." After Thompson left, the young recruit tried to return to his mental exercises, but something about the loneliness of the night made them less effective. His mind kept drifting to doubts and questions. Why was he here? Was this really worth it? He could be home right now, warm in bed, living a normal life. He could quit tomorrow and no one back home would judge him. Most of them probably thought this was crazy anyway. These thoughts were dangerous, he realized. This was exactly what Dr. Patterson had warned them about. the idle mind turning against itself, undermining resolve, creating doubt where there should be certainty. He tried to retreat to his mental fortress, but even that felt harder in the dark. The walls of his imaginary safe room seemed thin and fragile. A sound made him snap to full alertness. Footsteps, real ones, not imagined. Someone was walking across the courtyard toward him. His hand tightened slightly on his rifle. Every sense was suddenly sharp and focused. The figure came into the light, and he recognized the uniform of a palace security officer making rounds. "Cold night," the officer said conversationally as he passed. The recruit remained silent and motionless, as protocol demanded. The officer nodded as if expecting no response and continued on his patrol. But that brief moment of real interaction had shocked the recruit's system awake again. The adrenaline of not knowing who was approaching had cleared away the fog of fatigue. Thompson reappeared around 3 in the morning. "How are you doing?" he asked quietly. "Tired, sir," the recruit admitted, "and my mind keeps going to strange places." "Good," Thompson said, surprising him. "You are being honest about it, which means you are aware of it. Let me teach you something that has kept me going through hundreds of night watches. It is called the mental game technique, and every long-term guard has their own version." Thompson explained that during night watch, he gave his mind specific tasks to stay occupied. Sometimes he would try to remember every person he had ever met, going year by year through his life. Other times he would mentally redesign his house, planning renovations in elaborate detail. Sometimes he would write entire novels in his head, creating characters and plots that would never be written down but existed fully in his imagination. The key is to make the games complex enough that they require real mental effort, Thompson said. If it is too simple, your mind wanders. If it is too complex, you get frustrated and lose focus on your actual duty. You need something in the middle, something that occupies your thoughts without consuming them entirely. He shared another technique. Count things, but make it interesting. Do not just count to 100. Instead, count only prime numbers. Or count backward from 1,000 by 17s. Or count in different languages if you know them. The slight difficulty of the task keeps your mind engaged without overwhelming it. Thompson stayed with the recruit for a while, sharing stories from his years of service. Stories of strange things that happened during night watch. A fox that regularly visited one post and became almost like a companion to the guard stationed there. The time he stood through a thunderstorm so intense he could barely see 3 feet in front of him. The night a famous actor stumbled out of a nearby party and tried to have a conversation with him, not realizing he was not going to respond. The hardest nights are not the cold ones or the boring ones, Thompson said thoughtfully. The hardest nights are when something happens in your personal life that you cannot stop thinking about. A breakup, a sick family member, a financial problem. Those thoughts are like wolves, and at 3 in the morning when you are exhausted and alone, they can tear you apart if you let them. He looked at the young recruit with understanding eyes. You will have nights like that eventually. Everyone does. And on those nights, you will discover something important about yourself. You will learn whether you can compartmentalize your personal struggles and do your duty anyway, or whether you let them compromise your performance. That is the real test of being unflappable, not whether you can ignore a tourist making funny faces, but whether you can stand guard with a broken heart or a worried mind. The 4th hour approached, and true to Thompson's prediction, it was the hardest yet. The recruit's entire body ached from standing. His eyes felt like sandpaper. His mind was playing tricks again, showing him movement and shadows, making him hear sounds that were not there. Time seemed to have stopped completely. Each minute felt like an hour. But he used everything he had learned. He wiggled his toes to keep circulation going. He did breathing exercises to stay alert. He played mental games, trying to remember the names of everyone from his primary school. He retreated partially to his mental fortress when the discomfort became too intense. He acknowledged his fatigue without letting it control him. Thompson appeared one final time just before dawn. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that beautiful moment when night surrenders to day. The morning briefing had a different energy to it. The head sergeant stood before the 32 remaining recruits with something approaching respect in his eyes. These men had survived nearly 6 months of brutal training. They had been broken down and rebuilt. They had learned to master their bodies and their minds in ways most people never would. But one final test remained. "Gentlemen," the sergeant began, his voice carrying across the silent room. You have trained in controlled environments. You have practiced with actors and fellow recruits. You have stood night watch with veteran guards nearby to help if needed. Today that all ends. Today you will stand a full ceremonial shift at Buckingham Palace with real tourists, real crowds, and real consequences for any mistakes. This is your final examination. Pass, and you will be inducted into the Queen's Guard. Fail, and you go home. There is no middle ground. The young recruit felt his stomach flip. This was it. Everything he had worked for, suffered for, endured for, came down to one 4-hour shift standing at the most famous palace in the world. You will be in full ceremonial dress, the sergeant continued. You will be assigned posts around the palace grounds. Members of the public have been informed through social media that today is a graduation ceremony for new guards, which means there will be larger crowds than usual, and some people will specifically try to test you. We have plainclothes sergeants in the crowd who will be watching your every move. One laugh, one smile, one break in composure, and you are finished. They were given 2 hours to prepare. The young recruit polished his boots until he could see his reflection in them. He pressed his red tunic until there was not a single wrinkle. He carefully positioned his bearskin hat, making sure it sat at exactly the right angle. He checked his rifle 3 times, ensuring it was immaculately clean and properly maintained. Every detail had to be perfect. The bus ride to Buckingham Palace was silent. Each recruit was lost in his own thoughts, his own preparations, his own fears. The young recruit used the time to enter his mental fortress, building those walls strong and high, preparing himself for whatever the next 4 hours would bring. They arrived at the palace to find crowds already gathering. Hundreds of tourists lined the barriers, cameras ready, pointing and talking excitedly. The recruit had seen these crowds before during training visits, but somehow today they looked more intimidating. These were real people with no script, no training, no limits on what they might do or say. He was assigned to a post on the left side of the main gates, one of the most visible and heavily trafficked positions. As he marched to his post and took his position, he heard the crowd's noise increase. People were already taking photos, already pointing. He stared straight ahead, his face expressionless, his body perfectly still. The test had begun. The first 20 minutes were manageable. People took photos from a respectful distance. Some waved, trying to get his attention, but most just observed. He used his breathing techniques, settled into his stance, and found his center. So far, so good. Then a group of teenagers approached, phones out and recording. "I bet I can make him laugh," one of them said loudly. They began their assault. Funny faces, ridiculous dances, crude jokes. The recruit had faced this exact scenario dozens of times in training. He remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on a point in the distance, his face carved from stone. After 10 minutes of trying, the teenagers gave up and moved on, slightly disappointed. But they were just the warm-up act. Around the 40-minute mark, a drunk man stumbled up to the barrier, his words slurred and aggressive. "Think you are special, do you?" he shouted at the recruit. "Standing there like you are better than everyone else. You are just a toy soldier, mate. A puppet in a fancy costume." The man's friends tried to pull him away, but he continued shouting insults, some of them quite personal and crude. The recruit felt anger rising in his chest. Every instinct wanted to respond, to defend himself, to tell this drunk idiot exactly what he thought of him. But he channeled Dr. Patterson's teachings. He acknowledged the anger, placed it in a mental box in his fortress room, and returned to his calm center. The drunk man was not worth breaking 6 months of training. He was just noise, no different than the recordings they had practiced with. After a few minutes, security personnel escorted the man away. The next challenge came from an unexpected direction. A young mother approached with a child who could not have been more than 5 years old. The little girl looked up at the recruit with wide, innocent eyes. "Mummy, is he real?" she asked in that sweet voice only small children have. "Can he hear me? Why does not he move?" The mother smiled and began explaining about the Queen's Guard, while the little girl continued to stare at the recruit with pure curiosity. She waved at him. She asked him questions. She told him about her favorite toy. Every word, every gesture was innocent and pure, and it hit the recruit harder than any of the provocations had. This was his trigger. Children reminded him of his sister, of family, of the normal human connections he had sacrificed to be here. He felt his eyes beginning to water. His throat tightened. The corner of his mouth wanted desperately to smile at this innocent child who just wanted to know if he was real. But he was ready for this. He had trained specifically for this exact scenario. He acknowledged the emotion, recognized the trigger, placed it carefully in his mental box. Yes, this reminds me of my sister. Yes, this is hard. Yes, I will think about this later. But right now I am on duty. The mantra repeated in his mind until the emotion receded. His face remained perfectly neutral. After a few minutes, the mother took her daughter's hand and they moved on. By the 2-hour mark, the recruit had faced every type of provocation in the playbook. People making kissing noises, groups singing crude songs, someone trying to take a selfie while touching his uniform, a person asking increasingly absurd questions, someone attempting to place objects near his feet. Through it all, he remained absolutely motionless and silent, a statue in red and black. Then came a moment that truly tested everything he had learned. A person approached who seemed genuinely interested in the history and tradition of the guards. They stood at a respectful distance and began talking, not to provoke a reaction but seemingly out of real appreciation. My grandfather served as a Queen's Guard, the person said quietly. He told me stories about standing in the rain, in the heat, through everything. He said it was the hardest and proudest thing he ever did. I just want you to know that people like me see past the uniform. We know you are a real person doing an incredibly difficult job, and we respect that. The words were kind, genuine, and completely unexpected. The recruit felt a lump forming in his throat. After 2 hours of harassment and provocation, this simple acknowledgement of his humanity was almost overwhelming. It would be so easy to smile, to nod, to acknowledge this person's kindness, but he could not. The rules applied equally whether someone was being cruel or kind. He remained frozen, though inside his fortress he felt gratitude for those words. The 3rd hour brought physical challenges. The summer sun beat down mercilessly. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his uniform. He felt the warning signs of heat exhaustion beginning. Tunnel vision at the edges, slight dizziness. But he used all his training. He wiggled his toes to keep circulation moving. He controlled his breathing. He shifted his weight subtly. He was not going to faint, not today, not during his final test. A particularly aggressive tourist pushed past the barriers, reaching toward the recruit's rifle. Without thinking, his training took over. He executed a perfect stomp forward, bringing his rifle down to a defensive position, step back from the Queen's Guard. His voice boomed with authority across the courtyard, and the tourist nearly fell backward in shock. Security personnel immediately moved in to handle the situation. The recruit returned smoothly to his original position, as if nothing had happened. That was the correct response, the authorized response, and he had executed it flawlessly. The final hour was perhaps the quietest. The crowd had thinned as people moved on to other attractions. The recruit was left largely alone with his thoughts, his aching body, and the endless stretch of time. This was what Thompson had warned him about. The hardest part was not the harassment, but the boredom, the isolation, the voice in his head questioning everything. But he had tools now. He played his mental games. He counted prime numbers. He mentally walked through his childhood home. He retreated to his fortress when needed. He acknowledged his discomfort without letting it control him. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each minute stretching into what felt like an hour, but he did not break. He stood firm. Finally, mercifully, he heard the whistle signaling the end of his shift. Relief guards marched out to take positions. He was allowed to march away from his post, his 4 hours complete. As he walked back toward the barracks, legs stiff and body exhausted, he passed the head sergeant who was watching from a distance. The sergeant gave him the smallest of nods. It was not a smile, not praise, just a simple acknowledgement. But to the recruit it meant everything. He had passed 6 months of hell, of being broken down and rebuilt, of learning to master his body and mind, had led to this moment. 6 months had passed since the young guard took his official oath. The ceremony felt like a lifetime ago now, though in reality it had been just half a year. He stood at his familiar post outside Buckingham Palace on a sweltering summer afternoon, the kind of day where the heat created shimmering waves in the air, and tourists wilted after just minutes in the sun. He'd been standing for nearly 3 hours now. His uniform was soaked with sweat. His feet ached. His back was stiff. But these sensations were just background noise now, barely registering in his consciousness. He had learned to exist in a state where physical discomfort was simply irrelevant. It was there, he acknowledged it, but it had no power over him. The crowds today were particularly large. School holidays meant families from around the world. Children running and playing, parents snapping endless photos. The guard watched them without really seeing them. His eyes focused on a distant point, his face showing no emotion whatsoever. Then something unexpected happened. He felt a slight weight on his head. Something had landed on his bearskin hat. At first he thought perhaps a leaf had fallen, though there were no trees directly above him. Then he heard the cooing sound. A pigeon had landed on his hat and was now settling in, as if it had found the perfect roosting spot. The crowd noticed immediately. Laughter erupted. Phones came out by the dozens. People called their friends over to see. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered specifically to watch the guard with a pigeon on his head. The bird cooed contentedly, completely unbothered by the attention or by the unusual perch it had chosen. Inside his mental fortress, the guard was amused. This was definitely not something they had trained for, but the principles remained the same. An external event, even an unusual one, did not require a reaction. The pigeon was not a threat. It was not causing him harm. It was simply there, much like the tourists or the heat or any other aspect of his environment that he did not control. The bird stayed for 20 minutes. 20 full minutes of sitting on his head while hundreds of people took photos and videos. The guard's face never changed expression. He did not try to shake it off. He did not look up or adjust his position. He simply continued standing as he would have if the pigeon had never arrived. Eventually, the bird decided it had rested enough and flew away, leaving a small white dropping on the shoulder of his red tunic. The crowd applauded and cheered as if they had just witnessed a performance. Some people thanked him for being a good sport about it, though of course he gave no response. A mother told her children that the guard must be the bravest man in the world to let a bird sit on his head without moving. A few people left tips in a nearby collection box, thinking he had somehow orchestrated the whole thing as entertainment. What the crowd did not know, what they could not see, was that this moment meant something deeper to the guard. It was proof of how much he had changed from the nervous recruit who arrived at Wellington Barracks nearly a year ago. That person would have been mortified by a bird landing on his head. He would have been distracted by the laughter, embarrassed by the attention, worried about looking foolish. But that person no longer existed. As his shift ended and he marched away from his post, he passed his former training sergeant, who had been observing from a distance. The sergeant fell into step beside him once they were away from the crowds. "That video is going to be all over social media by tonight," the sergeant said. "Probably get millions of views." The guard who let a pigeon nest on his head without even blinking. The guard allowed himself a small smile now that he was off duty. "It was an unusual situation, sir." "Unusual situations are what test you," the sergeant replied. "Anyone can stand still when conditions are normal. But when something completely unexpected happens, when the entire crowd is watching to see how you will react, that is when your training really shows. You did well today." That evening, back in his quarters, the guard checked his phone and discovered the sergeant had been right. The video was everywhere. Millions of views across different platforms, comments from people around the world. Some found it hilarious. Others were impressed by his discipline. A few criticized the bird for being disrespectful, but most comments expressed amazement that he had not reacted at all. "How does he just stand there?" One comment read, "I would have freaked out. That's not a human, that's a statue," another claimed. "The discipline this requires is insane," someone else wrote. Mad respect. Reading through the comments, the guard realized that most people genuinely could not understand how someone could remain so calm in that situation. They saw it as superhuman, as impossible, but he knew the truth. It was not superhuman. It was training. It was discipline. It was the mental fortress he had built brick by brick over months of grueling work. He thought back to all the stages of his training. The standing exercises that taught him to ignore physical discomfort. The ego-breaking sessions that taught him his thoughts about himself did not matter. The fainting drills that taught him to work with his body's limits rather than fight them. The provocation training that taught him to separate external chaos from internal calm. The mental fortress techniques that taught him to control where his consciousness focused. The night watches that taught him to stand alone with only his discipline to sustain him. The final test that taught him he could endure anything, All of those lessons had combined to create someone who could stand perfectly still while a pigeon made a nest on his head. Someone who was truly unflappable. A few days later, he was back at his post during another hot afternoon. A familiar face approached from the crowd. It was Thompson, the veteran guard who had mentored him during night watch training. Thompson was in civilian clothes now, retired after 14 years of service. "Saw your video," Thompson said with a grin. "Very impressive. Though I have to tell you, in my 12 years of active duty, I never had a bird land on me." "You got lucky." They chatted briefly, and Thompson shared some wisdom. "You know what the real test is? It's not the pigeon or the drunk tourist or the long hot days. The real test comes years from now, when this is routine, when standing guard is no longer new or challenging, when it is just your job that you do day after day. That is when you find out if you are truly committed to this discipline, or if you were just getting through training." Thompson's words stayed with the guard as he returned to his post. Was he really unflappable? Or had he just learned to fake it long enough to pass training? The answer came to him as he settled into his stance, as he felt the familiar routine of checking his posture, focusing his mind, building his mental fortress. This was not fake. This was who he was now. He was no longer pretending to be calm. He was genuinely calm. He was not suppressing reactions. He simply did not have those reactions anymore. Or when he did, he could acknowledge them and let them pass without being controlled by them. The training had not taught him to pretend to be unflappable. It had actually made him unflappable. A school group approached, young children with their teacher. They gathered around, and the teacher began explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. She spoke about the tradition dating back centuries, about the discipline required, about how these guards represented something larger than themselves. "Are they allowed to talk?" one child asked. "No," the teacher explained. "They must remain completely silent and still while on duty. They are protecting the palace and upholding a tradition that has existed for hundreds of years." "But what if they need to go to the bathroom?" another child asked, prompting giggles from the group. The teacher smiled. They learned to manage that during their training. These guards are some of the most disciplined soldiers in the world. They can stand for 4 hours without moving, no matter what happens around them. The guard listened to this explanation while maintaining his perfect stillness. The teacher was right, but she could not fully explain what it took to achieve this level of discipline. She could not describe the months of breaking down and rebuilding. She could not convey the mental tools required to master your own mind. She could not express the pride that came from becoming something most people thought impossible. As the school group moved on, the guard reflected on his journey. He had arrived at Wellington Barracks as an ordinary person with a dream. He had endured physical and mental torture that broke half the recruits who started with him. He had learned to stand when every fiber of his being wanted to sit. He had learned to remain calm when everything around him was chaos. He had learned to separate his consciousness from his circumstances. But more than that, he had learned something profound about human potential. Most people went through life controlled by their discomfort, their boredom, their emotions, their wandering thoughts. They were prisoners of their own minds without even realizing it. But through his training, he had learned that this did not have to be the case. The mind could be trained, mastered, controlled. Physical discomfort could be acknowledged without being obeyed. Emotions could be felt without being acted upon. Thoughts could be observed without being believed. This realization extended far beyond standing guard at a palace. It was a life lesson disguised as military training. In any situation, no matter how challenging,